She slipped out the chapel window mid-ceremony. A farmer rode beside her all night. The thing I remember first is the sound her boots made hitting the ground. Not the ceremony itself, not the organ, not Harlan Beecher standing up at the altar with his hat in his hands and that smile he kept for other people's money. I remember the thud of 2 boot heels on dry earth, right outside the chapel's south wall, and then the quick crunch of gravel and then nothing, because whoever it was had stopped. I was sitting on the fence beside the water trough where I'd tied my horse. Wasn't inside. I don't go to weddings. I'd come into Garnet Creek to file a deed at the land office, and the land office was closed because half the town was packed into that little white chapel watching Emmeline Voss marry herself into a different kind of poverty than the one she was already in. I knew Emmeline the way you know anyone in a town this size, enough to nod at, enough to know she had her father's stubbornness and her mother's eyes, and that she'd been promised to Beecher since she was 17, when her father's note came due and Beecher bought it. She came around the corner of the chapel wall at a dead walk, dress bunched in both hands to keep from dragging, veil crooked and half off. She didn't see me until she was almost on top of me. She stopped. I looked at her, she looked at me. I said, "Land office is closed." She said, "I know that, Cal." I said, "Where are you headed?" She looked back over her shoulder at the chapel, and then she looked at the road north, and then she said, "I don't entirely know yet." Inside the chapel there was still organ music. Either nobody had noticed or the organist was playing very hard out of nervousness. I heard Beecher's voice, low and irritated, and then a woman said something sharp, and then a door opened and there were footsteps on the plank porch and voices spilling out. I said, "Get on." I don't know why I said it. I had a 2-hour ride back to my place, a fence section down along the north pasture, and no particular business in anyone else's situation. But I said it, and she didn't argue, and she was up behind me with her hands on my coat before I'd finished the thought. We rode north out of town at a walk so as not to draw it, and we were a 1/4 mile out before the shouting really started. Her name was Emmeline Voss, and she was 23 years old, and she had 40 cents in her dress pocket and nowhere to go except away. Those were the facts she gave me that first night, voice flat and matter of fact, like she was reading from a ledger. No tears, no apology for any of it, just the facts and then quiet, and the creak of the saddle and the prairie wind and my horse breathing steady underneath us. I am not a man who talks much, never have been. My father used to say I came out of the womb already tired of conversation, which was probably true. I farm wheat and a little corn on 240 acres outside Garnet Creek, and I have a dog named Soot and a barn cat without a name and a hired man who comes 3 days a week, and that is most of my life. I am 41 years old and I have never been particularly handsome or quick-witted or charming, and I have never minded that. I minded other things, but not that. What I minded mostly was being invisible. Not in any dramatic way. I don't mean people look through me like glass. I mean when I walked into a room, the room didn't change. When I spoke at the feed store or the land office or the occasional town meeting, people nodded and then went on with what they were doing. I had a reputation as solid and reliable and dull, which is the reputation that gets you a firm handshake and no invitations. I had friends the way a fence post has friends. They leaned on me and then went somewhere else. I don't say any of this to complain. I say it because it matters to what happened. Emmeline didn't treat me like a fence post. She never had, even before that night. She'd looked at me straight since we were both young, not soft, not flirting, just straight, like she was actually seeing what was there. It wasn't something she did special for me. It was just how she was. But there aren't many people like that, and you notice. We rode until the lights of Garnet Creek were gone behind us, and there was nothing but stars and the dark line of the plains and the warm smell of my horse. Emmeline had stopped talking. She had one hand at my back for balance, and I could feel the tension in it, the grip looser than it had been but still there, still holding. I said, "I've got a spare room. You can stay tonight and figure the rest in the morning." She said, "They'll come looking." I said, "I expect so." She said, "That doesn't worry you." I thought about it. Harlan Beecher was a man with money and connections and a temper that came out sideways, not in his fists, because Beecher wasn't stupid, but in his paperwork, in his debts, in his long memory for slights. He'd bought Emmeline's father's note, and if she didn't marry, that note was still good, and her father was old and not well and had nothing left to pay with. I said, "Worrying about Beecher won't fix the fence section that's down, so I try not to." She laughed just once, short and surprised. First sound of anything other than flat that I'd heard from her. It felt like something. We rode on. My place sits back off the main road behind a line of cottonwoods that my father planted the year he built the house. It doesn't look like much from the road. You can barely see the roof, and I have always thought that was a feature rather than a problem. Things that are easy to find are easy to trouble. I got Emmeline inside and lit a lamp and put water on the stove. She sat at the kitchen table and took the veil off and set it down and looked at it like it was a dead thing. The dress was cream-colored cotton, nothing fancy. She wasn't a girl whose people did fancy, and it had a smear of reddish dust along the hem from where it had caught the ground when she jumped. I gave her bread and cold beans and didn't say much because there wasn't anything useful to say. She ate like she was hungry, which she probably was, because you don't eat before a wedding, people said, though I could never figure out why. She drank 2 cups of water and then sat back and looked at the ceiling and let out a long, slow breath. She said, "I have been promised to that man since I was 17. I said, "I know." She said, "I should have run 6 years ago." I said, "Probably." She looked at me. "You're not going to tell me it'll all work out." "Don't know that it will." She nodded slowly, and something in her face that had been set hard all evening shifted a little, like she'd been waiting for someone to just tell her the truth of it. I said, "You can have the spare room as long as you need it. I'm not in a hurry." She said, "Why are you helping me, Cal?" I thought about that. There wasn't one answer. There was the simple answer, which was that she'd hit the ground running and I was the first thing she'd run into, and I wasn't going to leave her there on the road at dusk. And there was the other answer underneath that, which had more to do with Beecher and what I thought of men who bought women's futures with their father's debts. And under that there was something I didn't have good words for, just the fact that Emmeline Voss had always looked at me straight, and I was going to be worth being looked at. I said, "Because it's the right thing." She nodded like that was enough, and it was. I showed her the spare room. There was a quilt on the bed that my mother had made and a window that faced east. I got her an extra candle and an old shirt of mine that was clean and told her the outhouse was around the back and left her to it. I went and stood on the porch in the dark for a while. Soot came and sat against my leg. I put my hand on his head. The stars were thick and low, and the air smelled like cut wheat from the Johnson place to the south. Somewhere, a long ways off, a coyote was saying something to nobody. I was not afraid of Beecher. That is a plain fact and not a boast. I had no particular thing to lose that he could take. My land was clear, paid off 5 years ago, and I had no note out to any man and no debt to anybody in Garnet Creek or anywhere else. Beecher's leverage was paperwork, and his paperwork had no grip on me. What he could do was make trouble, and I had dealt with trouble before, and it usually came down to standing still and waiting it out. What I thought about, standing there on the porch, was Emmeline's father. Hector Voss was a sick man and a proud one, and if she didn't marry Beecher, that note came due and Hector didn't have it. That was the real knot. Everything else was easier to cut through. I went to bed and didn't sleep much. Beecher came the next morning. I had figured he would. He rode out with 2 men, not deputies, because Beecher didn't use anything official when unofficial was available, and they came up the road from the south around 8 in the morning when the dew was still on the grass. I was in the yard splitting kindling. I saw them come through the gap in the cottonwoods, and I set the axe down and waited. Beecher sat his horse a little apart from the other two, which was his way. He was a thick-necked man, not fat, just solid, with a dark mustache he kept trimmed and a brown coat that was too good for riding in. He had money in his face the way some men do, not in the features but in the way he held them, like everything he looked at was either worth something or wasn't. He looked at me and said, "Morning, Cal." I said, "Harlan." He said, "I'm looking for Emmeline Voss. I understand you rode out of town with her yesterday evening." I said, "I gave her a ride." He said, "She's on my property, Cal. We were in the middle of a ceremony." I said, "I don't believe she'd see it that way." His jaw moved. "Her father's note." "Isn't any business of mine," I said. "She's a grown woman and she made a choice. You've got paperwork against her father. You take that up with her father." One of the other men said something low, and Beecher put up a hand to quiet him. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that was meant to make a man feel small, to make him recalculate whether this was worth it. I have been looked at that way before. It used to work when I was younger and had less of myself settled. It didn't work anymore. I looked back at him the same way I look at weather, waiting to see what it would do. He said, "You know what I can do to you in this county." I said, "Tell me." He didn't like that. The thing about men like Beecher is that the threat is supposed to be enough. They're not built for the conversation that comes after a man says, "Tell me." He said, "You're making an enemy, Cal." I said, "I've had enemies. It hasn't killed me yet." He sat there another 10 seconds or so. The two men with him were watching me now, not Beecher, trying to figure out what kind of man I was. I didn't try to look like any kind of man in particular. I just stood there. Then Beecher turned his horse and they rode out the way they'd come, back through the cottonwoods and down the road south. I picked the axe back up and split 3 more pieces of kindling, and then Emmeline came out onto the porch and said, "He left." I said, "He left." She stood there a moment. She'd changed into her own clothes from her bag. She'd had a bag with her, which I hadn't noticed at first, which suggested the escape had been planned longer than a minute. Brown skirt, white shirt, her dark hair down and then pinned back. No veil. She said, "You didn't back down." I said, "No reason to." She came off the porch and stood beside me and looked at the road where Beecher's dust was still settling. Most men in this county back down from Harlan Beecher. I said, "I noticed." She looked at me sideways. "Doesn't scare you?" I thought about how to say it. I've been scared of things. Drought in '86, that scared me. Watching my father go into the ground, that scared me. Beecher's a man with money and a short temper. I've dealt with worse weather. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "What do we do about my father's note?" We, not what do I do, or what does he do, or some general question about the situation. We. I had not expected that word. It landed somewhere in my chest like a coal dropped on a plank floor, small but hot. I said, "I have some money set aside. Not a fortune, but I can cover what your father owes. I'd want the note bought out proper, through the land office, so Beecher can't run the same play twice." She stared at me. I said, "It's a loan. Your father can pay it back however he's able, no hurry, or not at all. I'm not keeping score." She said, "Cal, that's you don't owe us anything." I said, "I know that." "Then why?" I picked up the axe again because I didn't have a clean answer and splitting wood was easier than finding one. I set a piece on the block and split it and set the halves aside. I said, "Because someone ought to." She stayed 3 days, then a week, then 2 weeks. I didn't ask her to. I didn't ask her anything. She had her room and I had mine, and she helped around the place in a way that was practical and not tentative. She didn't ask where things were, she found them. She didn't apologize for taking up space, she just used it. She mended fence alongside me on the 3rd day, handling a post driver like she'd done it before, which I later found out she had. She was a farmer's daughter, Emmeline. She knew what work looked like. I went into Garnet Creek and bought the note from Beecher's man at the land office. $340, which was most of what I had saved. It cleared Hector Voss's debt, and I had it recorded proper, and I had the receipt in my coat when I rode back, and Emmeline met me at the gate and I gave it to her without saying much, and she folded it very carefully and put it in her pocket and looked at the ground for a long moment. She said, "I'll repay you." I said, "I told you there's no." She said, "I know what you told me. I'm telling you what I'm going to do." I didn't argue. Things settled into a rhythm. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't a plan or an arrangement. It was just a rhythm, the way a day finds its shape when two people are moving through the same space. She cooked because she was better at it than I was, which wasn't hard. I brought in the water and the wood. We ate breakfast at the same time every morning, and I told her what needed doing, and she either said yes or told me there was something else that needed doing more, and she was usually right about that. She was good company. That surprised me, though I don't know why. She was plain-spoken and had opinions and didn't fill silence with noise, and the opinions were things she'd actually thought about: land prices, water rights, whether the town council was crooked, which it was. She'd been paying attention her whole life to things that other people thought women didn't pay attention to. I started looking forward to breakfast. In a way, I hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. I didn't say that to her. I didn't say much of anything that wasn't practical. I am not a man who opens that kind of door easily. I had opened it once when I was 26, with a woman who ultimately found someone else, and I had decided after that to concentrate on the land and the work and let the rest go. It is not a bad life, that kind, but it is a life without a particular warmth in it, and you don't always notice what you're missing until something changes. What I noticed those weeks was the lamp on the table at night, the shape of another person moving through the kitchen, the sound of someone else's breathing in the house when the wind came up and the walls creaked. Small things, the kind of things that don't add up to anything dramatic, but that you understand when they're there, that their absence was a kind of cold you'd learn to live with. Beecher tried again 3 weeks in. Not in person this time. He sent a man to talk to my hired hand, Rue, to offer him money for what he knew about whether Emmeline was still at my place and whether she intended to stay. Rue told me about it the same afternoon, straight out, without drama. He was not a complicated man, and he did not like Beecher, which I had always appreciated. I told Rue to tell Beecher's man that there was nothing to report, and that if Beecher had something to say, he should say it to my face. 2 days later, Beecher himself rode out again, alone this time. He came to the door and I opened it and we stood there on the porch and I didn't invite him in. He said, "I want to know your intentions, Cal." I said, regarding Emmeline Voss. "She's been here a month. People in town are talking." I said, "People in town have always talked. It hasn't changed much yet." He said, "It makes her look." "She's under my protection," I said. "That's all you need to know." That word landed differently than I expected. Not on him, on me. Under my protection. I had said it to put Beecher in a certain position, to make him understand that coming after her meant coming through me first, and I meant that. But the word landed somewhere deeper, too. I was 41 years old and I had never said it about anyone. Beecher looked at me for a long time. He said, "You're nothing, Cal, you know that. You're a dirt farmer on a small piece of ground and you have no people and no connections and no standing in this county. You are nothing, and you're making a very stupid decision." I said, "Maybe." He said, "Maybe." I said, "I might be nothing, but I'm the nothing standing between you and her, and I don't move easy and you know that now, so." He stared at me. Then he said very quietly, "This isn't over." I said, "When it's over you can come tell me. Until then, good morning." He rode off. Emmeline was at the kitchen table when I came back inside. She'd heard. The windows were open and the house was small. She had both hands around her coffee cup and she was watching me. I sat down across from her. She said, "Nothing standing between me and him." I said something like that. She said, "You meant it." I said, "Yes." She looked at me for a long time, that straight look she had, the one that saw what was actually there, and not the version people decided on before they looked. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she was not a woman who was easily moved, and I could see something moving in her face. She said, "Do you know what it's like to have someone say that? Someone who means it?" I said, "I don't know. I've never had it said about me." She said, "Neither have I." We sat there at the table, and the morning light came through the east window, and soot came in from somewhere and lay down by the stove with a heavy sound, and nobody said anything for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the other kind. She went to see her father that same week. Hector Voss was in a bad way. Emmeline had told me he'd been sick, his lungs, from years of working around grain dust, and I had thought sick like men get sick, tired and slowed down but still there. But he was in his bed when she brought me in, and he was thin in the way that means the body is done arguing, and his eyes were clear but his hands on the blanket were like sticks. He knew me. We had not been close. I'd bought a load of seed from him once years ago, but he knew who I was. He said, "You're the one who bought my note." I said, "Yes, sir." He looked at me for a while. He said, "Harlan Beecher held that note 3 years and used it like a rope. You just bought it." I said, "Yes, sir." He looked at Emmeline, who was standing by the window. Something passed between them, old and complicated, the kind of thing a man can see but not name. Then he looked back at me. He said, "What do you want for it? I need to know. An old man needs to know what he owes." I said, "I don't want anything for it. But if you want to call it even someday, grow a good crop and buy seed from whoever's selling." He laughed, which turned into a cough, which he got through with a handkerchief. When he looked up, he was still almost smiling. He said, "Emmeline." She came over to the bed. He said, "This man's solid. You know that already. Don't be a fool about it." She said, "Papa." He said, "I'm telling you what I see." She didn't answer that, but she looked at me just briefly over her father's head and then looked away. Hector Voss died 6 weeks after that, peacefully in the night in his own bed. Emmeline was there, and I drove her out and waited outside and brought her home after. She didn't cry in front of me, but I heard her through the wall that night, and I sat in the kitchen with the lamp low and the fire down to coals, and soot came and sat against my leg, and I didn't sleep. In the morning she came out and sat down, and I put coffee in front of her without being asked. She said, "He liked you." I said, "I know, I liked him." She said, "He didn't like many people." I said, "I know that too." She wrapped both hands around the cup. She said, "He was the last of my people. I don't have anyone left." I said, "You have me." It came out before I'd planned it. Not like a declaration, not that kind of voice, just as a plain fact, the same way you'd say you have a roof or you have 4 walls, because it was true. She had me. That was just the state of things, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Cal." I said, "I'm not asking anything. I'm just telling you what's true. You're not alone." She nodded. Her eyes were wet, not running over, just full, the last line before something breaks. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window at the cottonwoods. I drank my coffee. She drank hers. Outside the light was coming up slow and gray, and the sparrows were starting in the elms, and soot was scratching at the door to go out, and the world was just going about its ordinary work, which is what the world does. It was 4 months total before it came to a proper end with Beecher. He had tried 2 more times to cause trouble, once through the sheriff, who came out and asked some questions and left satisfied that there was nothing to pursue. Once through a rumor campaign in town, which was nastier but also had a shorter shelf life than he expected, because a good number of people in Garnet Creek had their own history with Beecher's notes and his methods, and weren't inclined to take his side on principle. The end came not with a confrontation but with paperwork, which was how things actually ended with men like Beecher. He had overextended elsewhere. I learned this later, from the land office man, who was not particularly loyal to anybody, and the note he'd held against Hector Voss had been one of his smaller pieces of leverage. With that gone and his money moving in bad directions, his interest in Emmeline as a legal matter dried up. His interest as a personal matter I don't know about and didn't ask. What I know is that one morning he left Garnet Creek with his household on 3 wagons, and he did not come back. Emmeline heard about it at the dry goods store and came home and told me. I said, well. She said, well. I said, you can stay as long as you want, you know that. She looked at me. She'd been looking at me differently these past weeks, not studying me, not evaluating, just easy, like she'd already settled something in herself and was comfortable with where it had landed. She had a way of being still that I appreciated. A lot of people fill their stillness with restlessness. She didn't. She said, I've been thinking about that. I said, about staying. She said, about the staying and the arrangement and all of it. I waited. She said, I don't want to be your boarder forever, Cal, and I don't think that's what either of us wants exactly. But I also don't want you to feel obligated. You've done enough, more than enough. I said, I don't feel obligated. She stopped. I said, I never felt obligated, I just wanted to. I looked at the table. I'm not good at this, I should say that up front. I'm not a man who talks easily about this kind of thing, but I want you here. Not as a boarder, not because you have nowhere else to go, because I want you here. The room was very quiet. She said, you're sure? I said, I've been sure for a while. I just wasn't going to say it until it was right to say. She came around the table and she stood in front of me and she put her hand on the side of my face. Her palm was warm and rough from the work, the fence posts, the garden, the daily business of a working place, and she looked at me straight the way she always had, all the way in, not at the surface of it. She said, you are the steadiest man I have ever known. I don't know what my face did, something probably. I kept still. She said, I jumped out a window 4 months ago and you were just there. You didn't make a thing out of it. You just brought me home and made sure I was safe, and stood between me and every hard thing that came, and you never once made me feel like I owed you something for it. I said, you don't owe me anything. She said, I know, that's what I mean. Her thumb moved along my jaw, once slow, like she was reading something. She said, I want to stay, Cal, not because I have to, because I want to be here with you on this piece of ground for the rest of whatever there is. I put my hand over hers. Her hand was small against my face and strong from all the things she'd done in her life, and I held it there, against my jaw, and I didn't have the right words and I didn't look for them. I said, all right. She said, all right. I said, yeah. She laughed. That short, surprised sound again, same as the first night on the horse. She pressed her forehead to mine and I felt her breath, warm, and her fingers curled a little against my face. We stood like that for a while. The fire was low in the stove and the kitchen smelled like coffee and bread, and the particular smell of an October morning in the plains, cold and clean, a little wood smoke from somewhere, the faint sweetness of cut grass that had been on the wind all week. Soot was asleep in the corner and the cat was on the windowsill, and outside the cottonwoods were going orange and yellow, and the light was thin and good. I was 41 years old and I had spent most of my life being nobody in particular. The man at the fence post, the solid, reliable, dull one. The one the room didn't change when he walked in. The room didn't change. But she had her forehead against mine and her hand in my hand, and she'd said steadiest man I have ever known, and she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. That was enough. That was more than enough. We married the following spring. Not in the chapel in Garnet Creek. Emmeline had opinions about that, which I found reasonable. We did it at the house, with Rue as a witness and an old preacher from over the ridge named Calhoun who smelled like horses, and conducted the whole thing in about 10 minutes, which suited us both. Afterward Emmeline made a big meal and Rue ate most of it and then went home, and it was just the two of us. And the evening came down slow and warm over the cottonwoods, and we sat on the porch watching the light go. She had her feet up on the rail. I had my coffee. Soot was in the yard chasing something that wasn't there. She said, "Cal." I said, She said, "I've been thinking about the North Field. If we put in winter wheat." I said I was thinking the same thing. She looked over at me, that straight look, the one that had always just seen what was there. I looked back at her. She was 30 now, in a blue dress she'd made herself, and there was a streak of flour on her wrist that she hadn't noticed yet, and the evening light was on her face and she was grinning a little, the way she did when she'd been right about something. The land was mine and the house was mine and the work was mine, and now she was mine and I was hers, and the North Field needed winter wheat, and tomorrow there would be 100 things to do, and none of them would change the particular fact of this moment. The porch, the light, the cottonwoods, and a good woman sitting beside me who had looked at me straight from the beginning and found something worth staying for. I drank my coffee. The evening came down. That was that.